Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to moderate questions with Dr. Nouriel Roubini, Dr. Doom Parma Bear, but in our interaction before, I have found a warm, very intelligent, insightful person. So in next half an hour, I'll try to bring his views to you. Dr. Roubini, you wrote about 10 mega threats in 2022. How have you seen them evolve over the last 2 years? And what should we be doing to convert them into mega opportunities rather than remain mega threats?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's really a great pleasure and honor to come back to India and Delhi. I was earlier this year a couple of times in China, and you arrive to Beijing and there is a sense of funk, almost like mood is down, while as soon as you're out of the airport in Delhi, you feel the vibrancy and the energy of a society, economy, and political system that is strong, dynamic, vibrant, and so on. So it's always great being here. It's a wonderful country, wonderful people. You asked me about my book. I wrote in 2022 a book titled Mega Threats, 10 Dangerous Trends in Endanger Our Future and How to Survive Them. And unfortunately, I would say that some of the trends that I discuss in the books are becoming worse. One of them, of course, is that we live in a world of a geopolitical recession, if not a depression. There's already a hot war between Russia and Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's getting worse. It's not getting any better. We'll see whether it'll be the end of it. There is a war in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas. It could escalate in a full conflict involving Iran and Hezbollah. There is a Cold War between US and China. This Cold War by many dimensions becoming colder, and people asking themselves now whether it's going to eventually end up into a hot war on the issue of Taiwan or the South China Sea. And of course, we also have now the US elections. We don't know what are going to be the results. We're going to discuss them, but it could be a source, depending on the results of this election, of tensions, not just domestically, but also geopolitically. The consequences of this geopolitical depression is that we live in a world in which we've gone from a period of time where there was hyper-globalization, too much maybe trade in goods and services and movement of capital, labor, data, technology, information, to now a process of gradual deglobalization or decoupling or de-risking. It's driven by geopolitics, but it's also driven by the fact that globalization has winners and losers, that people are left behind, and those who are left behind having a backlash. So now we talk about protectionism, about industrial policies, about reshoring, friendshoring, about emphasizing global supply chains and their own security, and economic security over economic efficiency in the allocation of resources. There are restrictions increasingly to movements of capital, of labor, of data, information, and technology. It's going to become a more fragmented world, maybe safer from a geopolitical point of view because of the risky, but one is fragmented in ways that reduces growth and increases cost of production and inflation. We live also in a world in which debt ratios, private and public debt, are rising. And before COVID, interest rates were very low, 0 if not negative, policy rates in advanced economies, 0 if not negative, even long-term interest rates in advanced economies. And now with the rise in inflation, normalization of monetary policies, interest rates are high. And therefore, whether there are countries or governments or households or corporations or banking system or financial system, they'll be under stress because of this rise in interest rates. So debt servicing ratios are rising. That's going to become the economy much more fragile. There's a huge issue with global climate change, and every day there is a natural disaster. And unfortunately, this is not a natural disaster, it's a man-made disaster. And while COP, whether it was Sharm el-Sheikh or Dubai or Glasgow, has lofty goals, there is too much greenwashing and greenwishing, and very little is being done significantly to address it. Given current policies, we may not be at 1.5 above pre-industrial level, not even 2, but trending towards 2.4. So much more needs to be done for global climate change. Otherwise, the economic, fiscal, and human cost of it are going to be severe. We had a huge pandemic, and for a reason I cannot discuss right now, pandemics are going to become more virulent and more frequent than the past, in part related to global climate change, because as we destroy animal ecosystems, those animals that carry pathogens like pangolins, bats, and others get closer to livestock and human, and therefore the zoonotic transmission of diseases from animal to human become more frequently. In the last 40 years, we've had HIV, SARS, MERS, swine flu, bird flu, Zika, Ebola, now COVID-19. There'll be more of them, unfortunately, and that's a severe problem. We saw the consequences of COVID. Demographic trends are also a big issue. There is aging of population in advanced economies, but also in some important emerging markets like China, Russia, Korea, and others, and there is population growth in other ones. And in some societies like Sub-Saharan Africa, climate change, lack of water, desertification, collapse of agriculture is leading to movement into town, to civil collapse, to economic and political tensions, even civil wars, and mass migration. But now, the movement of people from south to north, from poor to rich, is restricted because, rightly or wrongly, US, Europe, and advanced economies are restricting migration as well. We also have an increase in both income inequality and income insecurity. And in some countries, that leads to a backlash against liberal democracy and democratic capitalism. And how to make growth inclusive and sustainable is a great challenge of the future. Otherwise, radical, extreme populists of the extreme right or the extreme left are going to become to power. And as we have seen in the past, these countries and these regimes become very autocratic, even aggressive, like in the case of Putin and Russia, from a military point of view. So we have to try to defend and reform democratic capitalism. And of course, as we'll discuss, AI is going to lead to lots of economic opportunities, but also a number of risks. So all these trends, in my view, are potentially stagflationary. They reduce economic growth, they increase cost of production, and they're like negative aggregate supply shocks that reduce economic activity and make inflation higher, leading to, again, to other economic and policy consequences. So the trends, unfortunately, are not going in the right direction. I would say that for every problem, there is a solution, and for each one of these challenges, there are solutions, but all of them require, in the short run, costs and sacrifices that have to be done at the individual level, at the community level, national and global level, for the sake of public goods, both national and international. But in a world that is divided by geopolitics, having international cooperation on the key issues of the future is hard. And given that these problems are global public goods problem, whether it is maintaining free trade, economic security, global security, maintaining resolutions of global climate change, of pandemics and other global issues, they require global cooperation. And this global cooperation, of course, in a world of divided global powers becomes more difficult than the past. So there is a path for a better future, but we have to be realistic about it, and we have to try to make sacrifices today for the common good.
Now, normally the leadership is taken by US, and right now it's going through a very polarizing election. Both the candidates and parties have widely different view on spending, taxation, deficit financing. How do you see US political situation and its economy shaping up in post-election scenario?
I would say certainly one of the biggest political, if not geopolitical risk of this year is going to be the result of the US election. First of all, we may not even know on election night who is the winner, whether it's going to be Trump or Harris. It could be challenged. Some people think of even political chaos, even violence potentially, if one side or the other challenges the results of the election. So we may not know who has won. And we saw what happened last time around with an assault against the Capitol. There is a risk even of violence in the case of the United States. I would say that depending on who is elected, the economic policies and the foreign policies are going to be, very, very, very different. If Kamala Harris is elected, there'll be more policy continuity in terms of domestic economic policies, foreign economic policies, relation with allies, and overall what has happened in the US so far. In the case of Trump, there is much more risks. There are risks to internal democracy. There are challenges of how to deal with allies and whether he's going to stick with the allies of the United States or not. There are questions about how he's going to be addressing relationship with China. But I would say that the biggest issue is going to be economic policies. He has said that he wants to impose a 10% tariff at least on all goods coming in the United States, even from friends of allies. He wants to impose tariffs up to 60% against China. He wants to make his tax cuts of 2017 permanent. They cost about $5 trillion. It's not clear as how they're going to be paid for. He wants to make the central bank maybe less independent and maybe replace Powell with somebody else. That's going to be also a source of concern and possibly even weaken the value of the dollar, leading to financial instability. If this policy were to be implemented, I would say that certainly inflation will be higher, growth will be lower, and there'll be risk of trade wars between the United States and the rest of the world. Hopefully, he's going to choose economic advisors, if elected, that will be more moderate and realize that this economic policy might lead to a stock market crash, to a bond market crash with much higher yields, and that's going to be the type of market discipline that the US needs. US has a lot of economic strengths, especially in many of the industries of the future, but there's also a very partisan and dysfunctional political system. US society is highly divided, and I think that's the main weakness. And that's leading also to a fiscal situation that is unsustainable. Being the global reserve currency implies that the US can finance itself, both its fiscal and its current account, twin deficits, much for longer and cheaper than otherwise. But that's a risk because it implies that over time there is no market discipline that forces countries other than the US to do fiscal adjustments that are necessary. So I think that the fiscal situation of the US and the political situations are the biggest risk, but there is a strong dynamism of the private sector. In most of the technology of the future, the US is still ahead of most other countries, and we'll see whether the results of the election leads to economic, political, and social stability or more volatility. It depends very much on how the results of election do occur.
The challenger to US for global dominance is China. And you recently wrote how China is getting into trouble with the middle income trap, with myriad issues like debt, real estate bubble, even policy making. What do you think China will do in terms of policy making? And will they be able to correct the situation?
Well, on one side, I would say that China has been an amazing economic success story. Of course, for over 3 decades, it was growing about 10%. Even before COVID, it was 7%. Right after COVID, it was 5%. I've been a few times recently to China, and even local economists suggest that with unchanged economic policies, the potential growth of China is going to fall towards 3% by the end of this decade. It's very low because China used to grow 10%, while India, as we'll discuss, can grow already now 6-7%, and with reforms more than that. Why growth is going to be so low? One, you have aging of population. The population of China is going to fall by 50% over the next few decades. You have 2 parents and 1 child. When the parents are gone, you have only 1 child, so population is going to collapse. You have an overhang of real estate, both housing and commercial and infrastructures, that used to be 25% of GDP, excessive, now has gone in the bust. There's a huge amount of leverage in the private and the public sector as well. Private and public debt as a share of GDP is about over 300% in the case of China, is huge, and that overhang is going to be a drag on the economy. Under Xi Jinping, they've moved away from market-oriented reforms towards state capitalism that has become negative for economic growth. They've been bashing many parts of the private sector, and the private sector is in a funk. Private investment now is very, very weak. And the old growth model based on infrastructure, real estate, has run out of steam, and there's not a clear other model. The only other clear model of growth that they have to increase more supply of new goods and services and dump them into global markets. Something's going to be restricted by protectionism in US, in Europe, but also in the global South. There are now technological and trade restrictions against China because of geopolitics. But the key issue about China is that consumption as a share of GDP is very low because the savings of the household sector is very low. And why is low? Because the Chinese have to save for old age, for when they get sick, when they lose their jobs, when they're migrant workers and don't have access to public services, because the share of labor in income is low and the share of capital is high. And therefore, this high saving rate is structural. And unless they create a social safety net so that people can spend more consumption and save less, there'll be a structural lack of demand, and there'll be too much supply, and that supply and excess capacity is going to go in global market now, facing protectionism and other types of restrictions. So the trend, given current policies, is in the wrong direction. It's true that China is doing well in some of the technology of the future, But again, their model is very much top-down, using state-owned enterprises and a subsidy system to have their own national champion. And that model may not be as successful as one that is really bottom-up and driven from the private sector rather than from the public sector. And the existence of the great firewall implies that in information and knowledge economy, you cannot restrict information and be successful in the technology of the future. And certainly the technological restrictions on chips and AI the US is imposing would also slow down the development of China in that direction. So I would say China is facing significant headwinds. The only hope is that at some point they realize that emphasizing security as opposed to economic growth is going to be a self-defeating policy, and they're going to change policy at some point, either with the current president or eventually with a new one. But even the results of the third plenum imply that there is a continuity of the current economic policy rather than real change and reform. And therefore, given the current trends, actually, my view is that by the end of this decade, US growth is going to be above 3% because of technology, while Chinese growth is going to be barely 3%. So the concerns that US had of China taking over the world are totally misguided.
India is transiting from coach of the global growth train to now engine along with China and India. There are policymakers like Mr. Amitabh Kant here and many distinguished entrepreneurs. What advice will be from your side to them so that India doesn't get bogged down in middle income trap?
Well, India, technically speaking, may not yet be formally, a middle income country, even if large parts of the country, of course, are already middle income. Per capita income, I think in India still maybe $2,500, while in China is above 10,000. So the risk of a middle income trap is more significant for China. India still has to get to the middle income and then get to the advanced level. I think the good news about India is that potential growth of India, even with the current policy, is at least 6, maybe 7%. And additional economic reform are going to occur. They're going to lead that potential growth to be 8%. So for the last few decades, China was growing much faster than India. In the next few decades, I think that is going to be just the opposite. Of course, India has to catch up, starting from a much lower level of per capita income. But for that economic success to continue, the kind of economic reforms that have already been done have to be continued and expanded. I'm sure that here everybody knows about them much more than I do, whether it's land reform or labor market reform or bankruptcy reform or more financial inclusion, more investment in skills and human capital, more reform of the bureaucracy and provision of public services. The list is very, very long. I'm quite hopeful that it's going to occur. Of course, the results of your election imply now a coalition government, but I think there is some cohesive views that certain types of reform have to be done regardless of who is in power. Those reforms might be occurring maybe more slowly than they would have occurred if you had a full majority of one party, but the direction is going to be the right one. And even if they're slower, as long as you're going the right direction, they're actually more resilient and more sustainable. One problem of autocracies like China is that you impose things on the people until there is a backlash, one. Two, you make severe policy mistakes, like Xi Jinping has done during COVID, or now we're going towards state capitalism. And therefore, having a vibrant democracy implies that the reforms may occur more slowly, but they're much more sustainable over the long term as well. So I'm quite optimistic that India is going to become a major economic power. It's already going to be, in the next few years, the third largest economy in the world. And with economic power, there'll be also more political and geopolitical power. And certainly, India is going to be one of the great global superpowers in the next few decades as well. But it's important to stick with the kind of economic reforms that are necessary. If there was an excessive slowdown of it, then things are going to go in the wrong direction. I would say also, in a world in which there is more technology, there's a risk of concentration of economic power of oligopolies and monopolies, and therefore maintaining economic competition, making sure that actually there is a vibrant competition is key and important. Of course, you may need to have every country some national champion, but you cannot really pick winners. You might provide subsidies for innovation of various sorts, but making sure that there is enough competition, because the competition leads to startups, to more innovation, rather than having oligopolies or monopolies is going to be also very important. So competition policies are going to be key for achieving that economic success as well.
Dr. Roubini, you have written extensively on artificial intelligence. And if I may add a bit proactively also, will AI overcome the human stupidity? How should we leverage AI so that it is beneficial to the economies at large?
Well, certainly anything to do with AI is going to radically change the world. I think that actually during the last year or so, there's been too much emphasis only on one aspect of AI, that is Gen AI and LLMs. That's only part of the story. There is so much more to AI. And I think the next revolution is going to be actually in merger between software and hardware and a massive robotic and automation revolution. You'll have robots that do jobs like human beings that are being invented right now. I think application of AI to biomedical research is going to make us live longer and healthier. That's another one. There'll be a revolution also in energy technologies helped by AI, not just green tech that is also important, but I would say fusion might be the great revolution in energy. It's going to allow us to have very cheap energy without any greenhouse gas emissions. There is space exploration. There is quantum computing and its eventual merger with AI. There is all these new manufacturing technologies and the creation of new materials. They're going to create new products of various sorts or another. There is a financial tech revolution as well. It's going to revolutionize financial services enabled by AI. There is green tech, there is ag tech. And unfortunately, of course, in a world of geopolitical power, there'll be weapon systems that are going to be semi-autonomous and others. So I would say there is a dozen of different types of technologies of the future, initiatives of the future, some related directly to AI, some indirectly. They're going to completely change, increase potential growth, increase productivity, increase economic welfare. Those are the positives that are going to occur over the next decade. And I think that the pace of that technological revolution is going to be very, very fast. And a country, by the way, like India, that has already a significant advantage in a variety of information technology services and much more is going to be discussed today, can harness the combination of hardware and software. And because of reshoring and friendshoring, a lot of actually manufacturing, high tech may move also to India and merge with the provision of information services as well. So that's one of the comparative advantages of India over time. So the benefits can be very large, but I would say that AI has a lot of potential, at least potential negative side effects. First one, of course, is misinformation, disinformation, deep fakes, and we already have seen in the past the use of AI to manipulate people's views and even affect the results of the election. The rivals of the US, of Europe, of democracies, they cannot beat these democracies with conventional weapons, are going to use cyber warfare as a way of creating actually division, partisanship within society. That's a real threat. And by the way, cyber warfare is becoming a threat both to governments and to private sector. The number of cyber attacks is escalating, and that's causing significant economic damage. People estimate that cyber warfare and cyber ransomware is already imposing cost of $1 trillion per year around the world. The other issue with AI, I think, is going to be a challenge. It's going to potentially lead to massive, permanent technological unemployment. If you are like here, people that are in the top 10, 20% distribution of skills, education, human capital, of course, AI technology is going to make you more productive over time. But if you are a low value added or even a medium value added worker, white collar, blue collar, over time, your jobs and incomes are going to be challenged. And how you address the question that, especially in societies where there is population growth, you have to give jobs to more people, is going to be a challenge that's be addressed. Of course, you have to provide skills education and making sure that everybody survives and thrives in an AI and technological-driven type of society. There is also a risk, I would say, of a rise in income and wealth inequality because these technologies are capital-intensive, skill bias, and labor saving. If you own the machines or the capital that owns the machine, you're going to do well. The profit is going to be there. If you're a skilled worker, an advanced one, you're going to be well. But again, as I said, the low value added, the income and jobs are going to be threatened, and a rise in income and wealth inequality is going to lead to a social backlash as well. I would say finally there's also the risk that we're going to build bigger weapons to fight bigger wars. Before World War I, before World War II, there were massive technological innovation that led to us to bigger weapons to fight bigger wars. And today with AI, the risk is going to also have a new round of war that is going to be driven by semi-autonomous weapons, robot soldiers, and eventually stuff that's going to make it much more deadly and dangerous. And therefore, there is a promise of AI, and there are lots of side effects and perils, and how to achieve a proper regulation of AI so that we get the best of it rather than the worst of it is going to be a challenge that every society is going to have to face.
Thank you, Dr. Roubini. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Dr. Roubini covering from global mega threats to US to AI.